Hi there. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever time it is. As always, happy whatever day it is you're watching this, and welcome. I'm Larry Erickson. This is the Erickson Report. And we start this time with the issue that has to be addressed, the acquittal of Kyle Rittenhouse. And I do have some comments on it, some general thoughts. Right at the top, I have to say I was not surprised by the outcome. I was bitterly disappointed, of course, but not surprised, notwithstanding the bruised knuckles I got from how hard I banged the desk when the verdict was announced. But no, I was not surprised, because from the start, this was effectively a baby-faced white boy on the one hand and three Black Lives Matter protesters on the other. Given that context, the defense didn't have to present a convincing argument that Rittenhouse acted in self-defense. They didn't have to present a persuasive argument that he was acting in self-defense. They only had to present a reasonably plausible argument that he was acting in self-defense in order to give the jury something to hang an acquittal on the grounds that the prosecution had not proved its case. Add to that a judge clearly biased in favor of the defense. I mean, he dismissed the gun charges on which Rittenhouse was all but undeniably guilty. He blocked prosecutors from showing Rittenhouse's connections to violent right-wing outfits like the Proud Boys. He told the defense at the same time that they could malign Rittenhouse's victims as rioters, looters, and arsonists. Given all that, the case was pretty much over before opening arguments. Now, I did hope, because I had to, I did hope that Rittenhouse would be convicted on the reckless endangerment charge, but there's no appeal from an acquittal. So the question becomes, what happens now? Rittenhouse himself is basking in his 15 minutes of fame on right-wing media, and he's being held up as a conquering hero on right-wing social media, or at least he was, because it appears he's being turned on now. He's had a blot in his escutcheon because he dared criticize the totally wonko and for that reason QAnon hero Lynn Wood. But what matters here is that it is being suggested across right-wing media that this case is now a legal precedent or even standard under which you could now go out and shoot lefty or progressive protesters and then get away with it by saying, hey, it was self-defense. Now, that's not actually true, of course, happily, at least not yet, but that's not the point. The point is there are people out there who could easily believe this is true. And when you consider some, in fact, many of the things that coterie of nitwits, that is the American right wing, believes, I mean, just consider that gang of folks in Dallas who may still be waiting for Godot. The idea that some of these people could actually believe that this is now a legal precedent and act on it, that's a real possibility. Hopefully, any such person would be deterred by the other news, keep hope alive, that less than a week after Kyle Rittenhouse was acquitted, the three bigots who murdered Ahmaud Arbery were convicted on a variety of charges and now face life in prison. This jury had to deal with 9 counts covering 5 felonies. Despite that, and despite the efforts of the defense to rig the jury and to appeal to racism in the hopes of getting a hung jury, frankly, I think that I hope that crack about Arbery's long, dirty toenails becomes a takeaway from this trial. Despite all that, this jury reached its verdict in only 10 hours, which shows how open and shut the case actually was, which undoubtedly was part of what led to the conviction. The defense did take a stab at self-defense, but that quickly fell flat, and the defendants were really convicted by their own words. Now, in addition to the conviction, there are 3 less attended facts surrounding the case that I wanted to mention. The first is that former Georgia District Attorney Jackie Johnson has been indicted on charges related to her failure to pursue the case, including violating her oath of office and obstructing the police. Second, the Georgia Bureau of Investigation is investigating former Waycross District Attorney George Barnhill over his refusal to pursue the case despite the evidence, apparently because of his son's relationship to one of the defendants. And three, one fallout of the case is that the state of Georgia has now reformed its so-called citizens arrest laws, something which we hope other states having these laws might now do as well. Now, beyond that, another way of hope, we can also hope that the lizard brains whose trigger fingers have gotten itchier in the wake of the Rittenhouse trial will also be deterred by the fact that in the same week that the Arbery verdict came down, a jury awarded more than $26 million in damages against 24 white nationalist individuals and organizations for the violence that erupted during that 2017 so-called Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, Virginia. This was the result of a month-long civil trial from a lawsuit filed by the group Integrity First for America on behalf of 9 plaintiffs who had been damaged physically or emotionally by the violence. And the case featured a vast collection of chat room exchanges, text messages, and social media posts by the defendants, proving that, yeah, they did intend that there be violence at that rally. Which of course came as no surprise to the rest of us, but it's nice that it's now part of an official court record. Now watch them all do an Alex Jones and just try to delay paying anything until everybody dies of old age. On the other hand, though, there could be more coming. Integrity First for America intends to refile on the 2 counts where the jury deadlocked. And 9 defendants who refused to respond or failed to respond to the original lawsuit have now been hit with default judgments, and the court will set damages in those cases. And finally, on all this, in a legally unrelated but politically and socially related case, on the same day Kyle Rittenhouse was acquitted, a Kansas City, Missouri white cop was convicted of involuntary manslaughter and armed criminal action for the killing of a 26-year-old black man named Cameron Lamb in 2019. It was only the second time in Kansas City history that a cop had been charged in the death of a black person, and only the first ever conviction. That previous case, by the way, was in 1942. So maybe this conviction means something, maybe these cases mean something, maybe something actually is changing. I don't know, but I'd like to think so, because like I said, keep hope alive. All right, next up, we have an update, or I suppose I should call that a continuation of my discussion about critical race theory. This was prompted by the fact that Secretary of Transportation Pete Buttigieg recently gave a good example of the kind of things critical race theory addresses when he noted that systemic racism in the design and location of highways in American cities and suburbs continues to adversely affect low-income communities and communities of color in this country. As a specific example, he pointed to underpasses along the parkways in the Long Island suburbs of New York City that were deliberately designed to be too low for buses for the specific purpose of keeping buses from bringing low-income, mostly non-white residents of the city to Jones Beach. Right-wingers first denied that any of that was true, and then being forced to admit that actually, yes, it was, they dismissed it as irrelevant because he said those underpasses were built 92 years ago. Yeah, but the thing is, they're still there. That's the point. The racism of 92 years ago is still impacting people today. They don't get it. And the fact is, they don't want to. I mean, it's already become clear that the MAGA meatheads who rant and rave about critical race theory have no notion what it is. They can't explain it or describe it. They just know it's being taught in public schools and they're flat out against it, whatever the heck it actually is. What's also becoming clear is what the actual objection is, and it's not to critical race theory. A Washington Post ABC News poll a couple of weeks ago asked respondents, how much do you think, this is the question, how much do you think public schools should teach about how the history of racism affects America today? Some 70% of the general public said a great deal or a good amount, while a majority of Republicans, 53%, said it should be taught not so much or not at all. As Laura Clausen of Daily Kos put it, that's not an objection to critical race theory, but an objection to kids learning that within their parents' lifetime and definitely within their grandparents' lifetime, the U.S. had explicitly racist laws that have continuing effects today. And the thing is, in fact, you don't even have to refer to continuing effects. A Monmouth University poll that came out a bit before the Washington Post ABC News one asked a slightly different question. Should public schools teach the history of racism? 43% of Goppers disapproved of that. 34% of them disapproved strongly of just teaching historical reality. And really, you can't even call it history, not just because of the continuing effects of past racism, but the reality of present-day racism in our society. But even if you leave that aside, even if you leave immediate present-day considerations aside, a lot of this stuff barely constitutes history rather than current events. I'm going to use my life as a timeline, okay? I was 12 when federal marshals had to escort a 6-year-old black child past screaming racist mobs so she could go to a newly integrated school. I was 14 when Medgar Evers was assassinated. I was 15 when Michael Schwerner, James Chaney, and Andrew Goodman were murdered in Mississippi for the heinous crime of trying to help black people register to vote. I was 15 when the Civil Rights Act was passed. I was 14 when Martin Luther King gave his I Have a Dream speech, 19 when he was murdered. These events and many others, they were part of my growing up. They were all part of my living memory. Now, I know I'm old, okay? I know I'm old, but it still means that in an historical context, in a societal context, these things were just not that long ago. And the fact is, at the very least, a significant number among those who call themselves Goppers don't want their kids to know about any of it. They don't want them to know about the segregated lunch counters in restaurants, the segregated waiting rooms, the segregated bus seating, the segregated schools, the segregated neighborhoods, the segregated drinking fountains, for pity's sake. They don't want them to know that as recently as 1967, 16 U.S. states still had laws banning interracial marriage, because knowing that would hinder their ability to continue to maintain their bigoted fantasy that they are the real victims, that they are the truly oppressed, and that racism no longer exists, except that is for the real racism, which is the racism directed against them. It's depressing and it's frightening. And we're taking a break. And we are back with a few things noted in passing, just a couple of quick things. First, at last, it appears that the government is taking corporate crime seriously. Too bad it's the government of Sweden. On November 11th, prosecutors in Sweden indicted 2 executives of the London Oil Company for complicity in war crimes perpetrated in Sudan between 1999 and 2003. And for those of you who are geographically astute, the reason I'm using this map is because these events occurred before South Sudan became independent. In essence here, the charge is that Chairman Ian London and former CEO Alex Schneider turned security for an oil field where the corporation had a claim over to the Sudanese military, either knowing or criminally indifferent to the fact that this change would and did result in war crimes, including massacres. The case marks the first time since Nuremberg that prosecutors have brought grave war crimes charges and indictments against individuals. As a footnote, the company released a statement saying there is no evidence linking any representatives of London to any of the alleged primary crimes in this case. In other words, they're saying, we didn't actually pull the trigger, so it's nothing to do with us. Sorry to tell you, gang, that's not how this works. All right, here's something interesting. On November 23rd, the DoD announced it is establishing a new group to investigate reports on the presence of UFOs in restricted airspace. The formation of the group comes after the government released a report in June encompassing 144 observations, which concluded there's a lack of sufficient data to determine the nature of these mysterious objects. This comes after decades of officialdom deflecting, debunking, and discrediting reports of UFOs. But what I personally find interesting is that the new group, the Airborne Object Identification and Management Synchronization Group, refers not to unidentified flying objects, but to unidentified aerial phenomena, or UAPs, which I find interesting because I've been calling these things that for it must be nearly 20 years now, speculating that they may actually be just some sort of entirely natural phenomena that are simply rare enough that we haven't learned to identify them yet. Much like the supposed UFOs that commercial airline pilots learn not to report for fear of being grounded, but which we now call red sprites and blue jets, and know they are types of lightning that strike upwards from the tops of thunderstorms. I wonder if I'll get any credit for the name. Finally, back in April 2015, Dan Price, CEO of Gravity Payments, a credit card payment processing company, raised the minimum wage at his company to $70,000 a year, paying for it by cutting his own salary to that level. He was marked as a socialist and lunatic of all lunatics, somebody whose employees would soon be on the breadlines. Well, 6 years later, company revenue has tripled, the customer base has doubled, 70% of his employees have paid down debt, many bought homes for the first time, 401k contributions are up 155%, and employee turnover has been cut in half. What's more, when the pandemic broke out, the company lost 55% of its business in 1 month. Price said he estimated the company was 4 months from bankruptcy. Instead, his employees voluntarily took pay cuts of an amount they each chose, seeing the company through till things could recover, which they have, to the point where those employees have now been paid back the amounts that they gave up. Apparently, being a socialist lunatic is not such a bad thing. One final note on this: when Price made the announcement originally, Rush Limbaugh declared that he hoped Gravity Payments would become a Harvard Business School case study of how socialism fails. Well, Gravity Payments is a Harvard Business School case study, just for an entirely different reason. All right, we end this week with our frequent feature, 2 weeks of stupid, clowns, and outrages, starting as usual with the clowns. We start with the fact that the Library of Congress has begun what amounts to a routine recataloging of changing the dehumanizing terms aliens and illegal aliens as subject headings to the neutral non-citizens. And guess what? To no one's surprise, our favorite bag of grease, Senator Ted Cruz, was very, very upset. This was a politically motivated move, he bloviated, called it an Orwellian attempt to manipulate and control language, which apparently labeling upwards of 12 million of our fellow residents as the other for purposes of fear-mongering and fundraising is not. Ted Cruz, always good for a clown show. As a footnote, the Blod administration has made some efforts in this direction, including a memo ordering ICE and Customs and Border Protection to drop illegal alien in favor of undocumented non-citizen. But dehumanizing language brings us to our next clown, supposed comedian, but certainly homophobe and transphobe, Dave Chappelle. You know about this, I'm sure, but it still bears sneering. Chappelle got returned fire after his new special was released at the beginning of October because of the transphobia it included, such fire including a walkout by some employees of Netflix. He responded by saying, "I said what I said, and boy, I heard what you said. My God, how could I not? You said you want a safe working environment at Netflix. Well, it seems like I'm the only one that can't go to the office anymore." In other words, he followed up being offensive by claiming that he is the real victim here. Classic clownishness, but wait, there's more. On November 22nd, at the screening of a new documentary, Chappelle tossed around the F word, made jokes about people's use of various pronouns, and pretended to identify as a woman to get a cushier prison cell, proving in case there is any doubt that he has learned nothing and doesn't intend to. But actually, no, in fact, that had been clear from the start. Back in October, he supposedly offered to meet with members of the transgender community, but he said, "You will not summon me. I will not bend to anybody's commands." But he said he'd be willing to meet under certain conditions. Quoting him, "You cannot come if you have not watched my special from beginning to end. You must come to a place of my choosing at a time of my choosing." In other words, you will not summon me, I will summon you. And thirdly, you must admit that Hannah Gadsby, who's another comedian and a member of the LGBTQ+ community, you must admit that Hannah Gadsby is not funny. Which is an offer that doesn't even hide the fact, doesn't even attempt to hide the fact that it is neither serious nor sincere. So I say to Dave Chappelle, one of the things you said in that special was, gender is a fact. Well, yeah, it is a fact, but just not in the way you mean, you ignorant dolt. Your sex might be defined biologically, but your gender is who you are. It is your sense of self. It's who you feel you are and who you feel yourself to be. Now, that feeling may or may not line up with your outward physical appearance. And the fact that difference between your sex and your gender can exist is what raises the whole issue of transgender. In fact, the technical term for people who suffer because of this is gender dysphoria. You'd think that growing up as a black person in the U.S., you had to deal with some issues of personal identity. So you'd think that you'd be able to have some understanding of the feelings of others dealing with a similar sort of question of personal identity. It's called empathy. Look it up. But you won't do that. You won't, because you find it easier and more profitable to punch down with cheap shots, which is just more proof that you are a thoroughgoing clown. We close with two outrages. The DOD's supposed call, this is our first outrage, the so-called 1033 program, was established in 2013 to transfer supposedly excess military equipment to local police forces. In the years since, according to Stephen Semler of the Security Policy Reform Institute, local cops have received nearly 70,000 firearms, over 5,000 military vehicles, and 358 aircraft valued at over $1.5 billion, including nearly $34 million in the first quarter of 2021. The program has been a significant factor in the dramatically increasing militarization of police, where cops more and more act like an occupying force than as protectors of the community, leading to more police violence. Studies, in fact, have shown a positive and statistically significant relationship between 1033 transfers and fatalities from officer-involved shootings. The more of the former, the more of the latter. This year, in debate over the National Defense Authorization Act, Representative Hank Johnson of Georgia proposed an amendment to exclude combat gear and weapons from the program. The outrage here is that this amendment failed, and it failed because 22 House Democrats, including liberal hero Eric Swalwell, voted against it. Now, it would take an act of Congress to completely dismantle this program, but there's nothing to prevent Joe Biden from issuing an executive order suspending the transfers or even demanding the return of some equipment, because technically this stuff is on loan from the DOD. In fact, Obama did exactly that. We'll see if Biden acts. If he doesn't, it will only double what is already an outrage. Finally, for this time out. Last year, 13-year-old Adeola Abraham Olugbegi was diagnosed with a rare blood order, aplastic anemia, which required him to undergo surgery for a bone marrow transplant. The good news is that Olugbegi's surgery, a transplant, was a success. But another bit of good news came his way. The Make-A-Wish Foundation granted him a wish. And he is using that wish to provide food for the homeless citizens of his hometown of Jackson, Mississippi for 1 year. Once a month for the next year, at least 80 homeless folks will be provided food donated by local churches and organizations. Okay, so why is this feel-good story here under the outrages? Because why should he have to? Why should this child have to give up this special gift to do something that our society should be doing as a normal part of its normal functioning, making sure people don't go hungry? The USDA, the Department of Agriculture, defines food insecurity as a lack of consistent access to enough food for an active, healthy life. And food insecurity is a very real daily issue in America. According to the USDA, in 2020, nearly 14 million households in the U.S., encompassing 38 million people, were food insecure. And 10 million of them had very low food security, meaning that there were times during the year when they weren't wondering where their next meal was coming from because they were too busy noting they already didn't have a meal. And the numbers might actually be worse. The group Feeding America estimated that 54 million were food insecure, noting that 60 million resorted to food banks to supplement their food supply during the pandemic. Now, the difference between those two estimates, 38 and 54, represents the product of the large-scale increase in aid driven by the COVID pandemic, an effort which kept the numbers as, pardon the expression, low as the USDA one, which happily goes to indicate that perhaps 16 million people in the U.S. might have been spared food insecurity last year by those efforts, but unhappily shows just how much more could be done if we were actually serious about it as a nation. Consider that a new poll from Impact Genome and the Associated Press NORC Center for Public Affairs Research uses somewhat broader definition of food insecurity to include people who would say, well, yeah, we can get enough food, but they despair at the idea of being able to afford fresh fruits and vegetables. Because the fact is, eating healthy is expensive. That survey found that 23% of the population of the United States fits that broader definition. Despite the increase in programs, despite that, nearly 3/5 of those people struggle to access the government and nonprofit assistance that should have been available to them. And more than 1/5 of them, that is 4% of our population, about 13 million people, said they had not been able to get assistance of any kind. 131 years after Jacob Riis's How the Other Half Lived, 59 years after Michael Harrington's The Other America, 57 years after the start of the modern food stamp, now SNAP program, 53 years after CBS News' Hunger in America documentary. After all these years, after all this time, after all the times we've been told, after all the times we said that we knew, we as a nation are still depending on private charity and 13-year-old children to, in the words of the prophet Isaiah, spend yourselves in behalf of the hungry and satisfy the needs of the oppressed. And that is an outrage. All right, that's it for the week. I'm going to close just with this. Starting in January, I hope to make this a regular feature of the program, going to be a new feature called The Threat. Because, as we all know, our democracy is under serious threat, and I want to cover a variety of aspects related to that. But for now, we will see you in 2 weeks. You have the best 2 weeks you possibly can. And as always, peace.